In lecture 3, wanted to just continue our discussion about globalization and what it looks like. And so the book talks about there's three important things that we need to be considering. First one's integration, then the role of multilateral organizations and also regional trade agreements. We're going to get into the multilateral trade organizations and regional trade agreements. We're going to get into those in more depth in next week in Module 2. So integration, as trade barriers are lowered dramatically to the point where they're very low right now, what's happened is, as the book says, it's exposed the domestic policies of countries as the main obstacles to international trade. So, for example, domestic content laws, environmental regulations have been imposed with an emphasis to, in some cases, to restrict trade. So it's not trade barriers between countries, but it's the internal domestic policies that are the newest obstacle to further increases in international trade. So that's that. But then also it's important to know that, as I mentioned the last time, for example, a car, during its assembly process, it goes back and forth between the U.S. and Canada multiple times. Many things are, even if it's manufactured in one country, the components are made elsewhere. And so domestic laws such as, made in the USA or made in China, it's increasingly the case that that doesn't really happen that much anymore. And the book talks about there's two levels of integration, and so what it terms shallow integration is the reduction in tariffs, quotas, and non-tariff barriers. So that's been happening over time. At a deeper level, where the action is now is on negotiations over domestic policies that impact international trade. So, for example, the United States is currently in the throes of negotiating the latest farm bill. Many of the provisions of that domestic policy have substantial impacts on our international trade of agricultural products, and as a result, because there's vested interests in domestically to protect certain agricultural sectors, cotton, for example, dairy, for example, sugar, and each of those have a vested interest and significant lobbying power. It's difficult, often more difficult to accomplish that than to lower trade barriers across national borders. So the action is on for both shallow in terms of lowering trade barriers and deep integration, focusing on domestic policies. Both of those happen at the multilateral and regional efforts. So the World Trade Organization, for example, at the multilateral level, it's trying to have an influence in how domestic policies are being shaped, especially if they adversely affect trade relations between member nations. Multilateral organizations such as the World Trade Organization, so multilateral means it's widespread and it affects agreements across broad ranges of policies across many countries. Regional could just be one country negotiating with another country, so they're more regional in nature, limited in scope, and have a narrower range of issues and goods that are being addressed. So like I said, here's some multilateral organizations. We mentioned the World Trade Organization. The precursor to that was, which we mentioned earlier, was the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. There's the International Monetary Fund, established right after World War II, the World Bank, established right after World War II, General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, the precursor of the World Trade Organization, established right after World War II, the United Nations itself, established right after World War II. So like I mentioned last time, after World War II, there was a concerted effort to increase the amount of trade and economic integration between countries. On a regional level, the United States, for example, is involved in NAFTA with Canada and Mexico, the European Union. They have regional trade agreements with themselves, and there's several others. The United States recently entered in the CORS agreement with Korea, and so those are involving fewer countries on more specific issues and generally regional in nature. So we looked at what is globalization, has it decreased over time, and why? And then the question right now is it a good thing or not? And so one of the things that economists agree on, so economists are famous on for disagreeing on most things, but one thing that most economists agree on is that international trade is beneficial. And so there's empirical evidence for this, which we'll get into in chapters 3 and 4. Economic reasoning and economic modeling demonstrates that there are benefits, and we see evidence countries by itself, and taken together, there's a host of not only just reasoning, models, and empirical evidence individually, but taken as a whole, is pretty clear that for the most part, countries are much better off with international trade than they would be without it. So some of the benefits is we have technological innovation occurring across countries and feeding off of each other. One thing that we'll look at with chapters 3 and 4 is the reason for international trade is countries specialize in what they have a comparative advantage in, what they can produce relatively less expensively. And so we get production of stuff produced at lower cost. And then we have specialization in terms of production and use of our scarce resources. So, as we mentioned before, for developed and most developing countries, the increase in globalization has been good. It's been increasing economic growth, increasing GDP, and increasing per capita GDP incomes for people. And the benefits, I would say it's probably fair to say that the benefits have not been uniform. Some countries, especially developed countries, have benefited more so than others. And so as a result of that, the focus recently over the last 15 years or so has been on let's increase the benefits for developing countries. And so the latest round of World Trade Organization negotiations called the Doha Round, or also called the Doha Development Agenda, because the express purpose of this round of World Trade Organization negotiations is to increase the benefits for developing countries. And so there's a nice little web page from the WTO, and here's the URL for it here in terms of the aims and what's been happening with the World Trade Organization and the Doha Development Round. So that's the end of this lecture, and one more to go for this week, and see you soon.